Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. I hope many of you, North American alumni in particular, would have met me one way or another, but I'm Helen Ghosh, with the great pleasure and privilege of being the master of the college. It's my particular pleasure to be hosting this conversation tonight between Bob Ray, distinguished alumnus of the college, Rhodes Scholar, politician, lawyer, diplomat, and so on, and so on. All sorts of so many other things that there are beyond counting. And then Harold Coe, who's with us back at Balliol at the moment for as our George Eastman visiting fellow, visiting professor. Having been previously a visitor to us as a Smithies Fellow, Distinguished Dean of Yale Law School, and advisor to various US governments. Such a privilege to be able to introduce them. This is going to be a spontaneous conversation. I know that Bob and Harold have thought a bit about what they might cover, and given their extraordinary careers, I think you would expect it to cover things like, you know, their time at Balliol, how you turn ideas into action, you know, the future of internationalism. I should say, to bring that last point to life, Bob has to leave us at very shortly before the hour. He can be with us for an hour because he then has to be at the UN in his current role as Canadian ambassador to the UN for a meeting there at 2:20 New York time. Just a very small, introduction from me about how we are at Balliol. We're back to normal life in all major respects. We've got all our students back, undergraduate students, graduate students. They're having a lively time. I've had a lovely 2 days. In 7th week of term, I see all the fresher undergraduates, all 120 of them as it is this year. And it's been such a treat to hear so many of them come in and say how thrilled they are to be here, how the course exceeds their expectations. They mainly talk, and this will ring bells, I'm sure, with many of you, about how they hadn't realized how hard they had to work. And they've spent quite a long time adjusting to how hard they've had to work. And many of them very sensibly saying they haven't tried to do much else rather than just keep their heads above water. Lots of them doing rowing, lots of them doing drama, lots of them doing all the kinds of things that you will remember from your time with us. And lots of them, which is particularly moving, saying how friendly and supportive they find the community. Part of the reason we've, as it were, survived healthily through the COVID outbreak is thanks to the generosity of so many of you over the years, but in particular supporting us with hardship funding so that we can help the students who've been at home needing tech, wanting to travel at various points in the crisis and needing support for that. And it's just been wonderful that we've been able to help our students through COVID and into what I hope are the sunlit uplands, that's a quote from somebody, isn't it, of their life in Balliol today. So I think that's enough from me. I will both mute and disappear. And I think I hand over to Bob and Harold to lead us through the conversation. I should say we hope we'll have, before Bob has to leave us, a little time for questions. And if you look at the bottom of your screens, you're probably familiar with this. There is a Q&A box. So if anybody has any questions that occur to them, we might try and find 10 minutes at the end to pick up some of those questions. But other than that, just enjoy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Harold. It's good to see you. It's a pleasure.
Great to see you, Bob.
Harold and I have been in conversation before. We should confess up that we did a podcast that I used to have before I became a colorless public servant, which Harold told me much about his life story, which was a terrific account of how he became one of the great international law scholars of our time, and the steps that he took to get there, which is a great conversation. But here we are, Harold, once again, just chatting away. It's very good to be with you. And I know you've been reading hard for this. There's no exam at the end, by the way, but I know you've been doing your research.
So Bob, I'm a little behind you as always. It turned out that in reading up about you, when you left Oxford, which was 1972, it was only 3 years before I arrived in 75 to study PPE at that other college, Magdalen. But I didn't get to Balliol till almost 50 years after you got there. And so I'm interested to hear your story and how your time at Balliol has affected the way you think about things ever since.
Well, Balliol was a wonderful experience for me in the 60s. I came in 1969 I did studied history at the University of Toronto and got very interested in my last year. I got very interested in the history of ideas. So I decided to do a B.Phil, which is, they now call it an M.Phil in politics, and I focused on political theory. So you wrote a bunch of papers. After 2 years, you wrote a bunch of exams and did a thesis. But Balliol was a fantastic atmosphere. It was, graduate students, undergrads. The only disadvantage was that it was all men. And looking back, it's kind of weird, right? I mean, it's a strange phenomenon that we still had the gender discrimination in those days. But it was very, very stimulating. Learned a lot, and yeah, as Helen said, you worked hard. I mean, it was hard work, but it was still fun and very, very wide-ranging students. Many of whom are still friends today, and which is a wonderful product of that time of life. Christopher Hill was the master. He was a great scholar of 17th century history and very, very interested in political ideas. He was a great buddy of a guy called Bruff McPherson, who was my political theory professor at the University of Toronto. So I sort of got to know Christopher a little bit. And did a whole bunch of things. We did theater, did shows. I played the part of a mirror in a comedy about Snow White. You can only imagine what the mirror had to say. And then for 2 years I taught in the summer school, which Christopher organized for students from 3 mining communities, to show you how things have changed. Students from 3 mining communities who were going into A levels and trying to get them interested in going to university. And so we had a summer school that went on for about 3 or 4 weeks in July, and I worked at that for two summers. I really enjoyed that. It was a great experience teaching, and it was wonderful experience. I was, and it was politically a very lively time, right? It was lots of demos, lots of activity, Margaret Thatcher, Milk Snatcher, all that stuff. There was a lot going on at that moment.
But your father also studied at Balliol, didn't he?
He did a year at Balliol. He finished his PhD at the London School of Economics, and he actually had an interesting time there because he was there for the last year before the war broke out. He was there 38, 39 with people like Dennis Healy and Roy Jenkins and Ted Heath, who he knew for the rest of his life, stayed in touch with each of them. And he actually did his thesis was on public opinion, and he actually took a poll of the Oxford by-election in 1938, where the Popular Front candidate was A.D. Lindsay, who was the master of the college, and A.D. Lindsay was a political philosopher. So we all studied his stuff. Yeah, no, my dad was there for a year. He didn't take a degree. He just he did his postdoc, I guess you'd say. He enjoyed it a lot.
Well, so Bob, you're a real insider at Balliol. I've just arrived. I became a fellow in October as part of the Eastman professorship. The Master Helen administered the oath, which included a pledge to obey the bylaws of the college, which I did. And then afterwards, she told me there are no bylaws to the college,
Good.
which was good to know. But when I was a student, Balliol was known for being a fiercely intellectual place. In the PPE crowd, Stephen Lukes and Bill Weinstein were sought after tutors and deeply admired Alan Montefiore.
Great people.
My friend Michael Sandel, now a very distinguished political philosopher at Harvard, was a student at Balliol and was very much admired by our group. But one of the things I have noticed since I've been there is the wonderful quality of the fellowship. Balliol seems to be virtually unique in that they have a dinner every week to which all fellows are required to attend. In fact, you attend unless you sign out, and so you are only charged for the dinner if you don't eat it. And but what it does is it's presided over by the senior fellow, and it's just an extremely strong community making event. And then the students and the fellows have a interesting bond also through any number of events, but particularly at Hollywell Manor, where you lived at least 1 year. I was invited to give a seminar there in the middle common room. And, there's an extraordinary group of international students. I realize that the graduate student population of Balliol are really the future leaders of liberal democracy, who happen to be gathered in this beautiful graduate dwelling. And one of the great things about it was I got there and everybody was really happy, so happy. I thought, oh my gosh, they're so happy to see me here. And then it turned out as happy because they had not been in this setting for 20 months.
Oh yeah, it's been rough. It's been rough for everybody, but it's certainly been rough on students. I mean, I taught for quite a while. I taught for quite a while just before I came here. Taught for about 6 years at U of T, and I think the last year was just the toughness of the COVID experience was really difficult, connecting with students and figuring out how to have a good sense of dialogue. I mean, the great thing about the tutorial system, I mean, we used the tutorial system for the BPhil, and the great thing about it was that it was just one-on-one or two-on-one, but it was always very, very intense and quite daunting. I mean, it's sort of scary, talking to John Plamenatz about John Stuart Mill and utilitarians, and he wrote the book, and he's sitting there, and he was one of the masters of what I would call the quiet reflection, and you had no idea whether he was really listening or whether he was. But of course he was, and very, 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 very acute. But I have to say that I carried with me for the rest of my life a lot of the basic approach of listening and questioning and challenging. Why do you think that? What would make you think that would be a sensible thing? I remember Bill Weinstein told me to go off and read Edmund Burke, and I said, "Why? I don't want to read Edmund Burke. Why would I read Edmund Burke?" And he said, "Because you don't know anything about him, and it's time you learn something." So I mean, it was good. And Bill was great. He was a great teacher, and totally engaged with all of us. I mean, very, very personal. And the fact that just before our audience came on, I was mentioning that we had a 80th birthday party for Stephen Lutz. And Stephen has been in New York all this time, and he's been, teaching sociology and sociological theory and political theory his whole life. And it was a wonderful tribute from students from 6 generations, chatting with them about, where they were going, and a wonderful range of people on the call from his most recent students to, old timers like me. It was great.
Tell me a little bit about your experience with Isaiah Berlin. He must have been one of the most famous intellectuals of modern times. I had one contact with him. I was a visiting fellow of All Souls in 96, 97. He was there, came to visit, and I walked into the lunch, and there he was sitting there and there was a space empty at his table. And I sat down. It was very hard to hear. And somebody asked him a question, and he answered. and it was completely unintelligible to me, but everybody laughed uproariously, and that was the entire meal. I ended up not being able to understand a word he said, but I I laughed uproariously with the others. But you actually engaged with him quite a bit.
Well, I did. I mean, he taught me and another guy, Joe Femia. Joe went on to teach at Liverpool University, and Joe did his thesis with Sir Isaiah on Gramsci. Joe Femia was from, I think he was from New Jersey, but he went to Columbia for undergrad, and Joe and I did the Be Phil together. And so Bill Weinstein said, I think it's good for you to, I'll see if you can get you in to see Sir Isaiah. So we did a special paper on Hegel and Marx. And we used to meet early in the morning on Monday, like early meaning like 9 o'clock. And Sir Isaiah was the head of Wolfson College. And so we would go and see him at Wolfson. And I have to say the first time was exactly as you've described. Because Sir Isaiah at 9 o'clock in the morning was sort of like an old Morris Minor starting up. If you remember what those cars were like, and he swallowed his words, and he spoke incredibly quickly. So it was really hard. And in fact, Joe and I were walking back to college after the first class we did together. And Joe, I won't use all the words that he said, but he said, what did he say? Like, what was he, did you understand? I said, I got most of it. I think I got part of it. I took notes. But I remember once sounding off it, after about 2 or 3 sessions, I sounded off on a topic about Hegel that I didn't really understand very well. And it was pretty clear to him that I didn't know much. And he said, Mr. Ray, I said, yes. He says, what is that between us? I said, excuse me? He said, what is that between us? And he was pointing at the floor. I said, it's a carpet. He said, right. What kind of carpet? I said, looks like a Persian carpet. So what do you see about it? Very pretty. It's a very nice carpet, sir. And he said, no. What do you see? What do you see? I said, I see a pattern. He said, aha, you see a pattern. I said, so you see the pattern. What do you see about the pattern? He said, well, it's a very, very beautiful, symmetrical. He said, that's right, symmetrical. Then he said, everything fits. I said, what? He said, everything fits. I said, what do you mean? He said, everything fits. Then his point was, for Hegel, as for Marx, everything fits. It's the world is there are no coincidences in the world. This is all explains it all. It comes to, and he said, and then he went on to say, you have to think for the rest of your life, you're going to have to ask yourself the question: are you somebody who thinks that everything fits, or are you somebody who thinks things happen? Odd things can happen, things can come out, or the chaotic world, whatever comes. And I have to say, as I've gotten older and older, I could see what he was getting at, just as I learned a lot over the years about Edmund Burke. And I have to thank Bill Weinstein for saying, it's time you read Burke on the French Revolution. And he was right. And the same thing with that experience with Berlin. It had a real impact, far bigger impact on me than I realized at the time. And I don't think I fully appreciated how lucky I was. And subsequently had a couple of visits with Sir Isaiah. After I was married, when I was a member of Parliament at that time, I went back to see him and introduced my wife to him. And they talked a lot about the Baltic countries where both their families had come from. And then when I was premier, I was able to convince the University of Toronto that they should give an honorary degree to Sir Isaiah, and he came, and it was after he'd had a throat problem, so he couldn't actually speak, but somebody else read his speech, and he was, you could see that he was failing, but it was wonderful to have him as a teacher, and it was really great to be able to pay tribute to him at that time.
So I'm interested. His essay that stuck the most with me was The Hedgehog and the Fox. And
right.
where he starts by discussing Stalin and or Lenin and Trotsky, and he says, Trotsky knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And then he divided the world into people who are hedgehogs and foxes. And I'm wondering, what do you think? How do you think you emerged into your next phase of life?
Well, I think one of the tensions, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was very much influenced by that as well. And I think for a while I was probably more of a hedgehog, and then as I got older, I became much more much foxier. And I think that's true now. I mean, I think it's not an unusual life course to say that at some stage you're quite full of ideology and brimming with truth, and as you get older, you become a little less confident in your ideologies and in your truths. But and that's a natural transition. But I was very glad to. I mean, it was a wonderful opportunity to have been able to really engage with him at a time when even though I must have been a bit of a pain as a student, but I mean, I think he was trying to steer us just by getting us to think a little bit more and reflect more. And he had a wonderful sense of humor. And he said something to me that was very kind, because when I went to see him before I left Oxford, and I thought I would, carry on with the DPhil, and I really kind of didn't. In the end, I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do at all. And I went in to see him, and he sort of said, "Well, what are you up to?" I said, "I really don't know. I'm not quite sure what I want to do, but I, decided not to do this." And he said, "You know something?" He said that the happiest days that I spent, and I think he was just saying this to make me feel better, was when I was working in the British Embassy in Washington in the Second World War. And it was politics, and it was all happening, and we were in the middle of history, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And he looked at me and he says, "Not everybody has to sit around here thinking big thoughts, Mr. Ray," as he would call me at that time. He said, you go off and see the world and do your best." And it made me feel much better, I have to say, because at that point I wasn't quite sure what the hell I was going to do. And he was very helpful. And I just sort of putting it in perspective, saying, there's a big world out there, not that the academy is a bad place to be. I've spent my whole life going back and forth in and out of the academy, but quite happy to have not only spent time in the academy.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I'm very struck by how in our own shared life experience, we spend our time going back and forth from the world of thought to the world of action and back again. And one of your friends and predecessors, Ed Broadbent, when I was at All Souls, he was there.
Right.
And, I didn't really know much about Ed Broadbent. I read about him. And I went up to him, he was writing a book, and I said, "Ed, how do you know when it's time to be in the political arena, and when do you know it's time to be at a place like All Souls writing a book?" And he said something that really stuck with me. He said, "When the desire to act is greater than the desire to write, act. And when the desire to write is greater than the desire to act, right." And he goes, "I'm in the later phase right now." And I took that as a tremendous guide, and I've followed it ever since.
Well, in my case, it was there were other people who decided it was time for me to write.
Well, let me ask you about something about that, because I was very struck in your book about something that I often wish I could say to people in the faculty lounge. I've been at Yale Law School for 36 years, and I was dean for part of it. But during that period, I've served in 3 presidential administrations, including most recently the Biden administration. And I had previously served in the Reagan administration. And you say something that really hit me. You said about being in the fray versus reserving the right to reflection in the crowd, but apart from it. And at another point, you say, being on the margins, waving a placard isn't ethically superior to being in the fray, making hard choices. I mean, how do you feel about that now? You're in the middle of it right now, doing the UN ambassadorship. before that, you were in the kind of a status of a wise observer. So how do you contrast these two experiences?
Well, I just think it's important to do both. And I mean, I think like all people, I was very much influenced by my father, who stressed the importance of engagement, and not thinking that being the critic was the most noble thing you could do. But I also think that it's really important to know that when you're in the middle of engagement, if you like, or in that moment of taking action, that you're guided by some basic principles, and the idea that somehow you should, pragmatism has no moral compass, I think is wrong. I think the issue is what are you trying to serve, and that's why I think I've always enjoyed still reading it. You don't stop thinking. You don't suddenly say, well, there's nothing left to think about. You kind of feel that you've got to do both. And I guess one of the things that, this is a Balliol exercise. The ethos of Balliol is about both these things. It's about thinking, and it's also about acting and doing. And there's a long tradition in the college of people engaging in public life, engaging in politics, but also engaging in teaching and thinking. And the two are not like antiseptically divided. They're connected. But I've been very lucky to be able to do both. I really feel that. At the beginning, I was very uncertain of myself, but I think as I've gotten older, I'm quite comfortable with defending what I've tried to do, but not in a defensive way, and also speaking candidly with students, saying, how would you have done this any differently? And I don't say it in a challenging way. I say, give me some guidance here. Tell me what you think you're motivated by. And you know that. That's part of your life too.
Well, it's interesting because Balliol has a tradition, as you mentioned, Harold Macmillan, Roy Jenkins, Ted Heath, now Boris Johnson. None of them perfect, but all of them sort of between the worlds of thought and action. And I was talking to a Balliol student who said to me, a grad student, I have a very ambivalent feeling about Balliol's relationship to power. And I said something, but it was now refined by thinking about your book, which is, you say at one point, look, power is not immoral. It's how it's exercised. It's a fact of political life. And I said to this student, I actually want you to have power as opposed to somebody else. But that assumes that you have the humanity to exercise it correctly and the intelligence and knowledge to exercise it with wisdom. And why not you rather than somebody else who is less humane or less excellent? And I think the student was a little shocked that took the fact of exercising power as itself a negative thing. And I think that maybe Balliol teaches people to from the beginning think about the consequences and impacts of their ideas working on society. I'm constantly struck every time I'm in the government by how far it is from a good idea to good results. That it just is so hard to get things done. So many people are involved, even to get an action out of one government. And then, when you're working on a multilateral plane to try to coordinate with so many different people to try to get to a better place. And you and I have shared some experiences on that with regard to the International Criminal Court and other things. And but maybe we should also talk about your current internationalist work, because one thing that you and I share, Bob, is that our dads were both ambassadors to the UN. You have had the unique experience of succeeding your father's ambassador. I haven't gotten there. I haven't given up hope. I'm not holding my breath. What's it been like to be in the position that your dad held at a different time?
Well, I mean, first, I mean, from a psychological point of view, I think it's strangely satisfying. I mean, not because there's anything, and it's not an inherited job, but because at this stage in my life, it's really good to be able to reflect more on the positive influences that my father had on me. And I mean, there was a point, like with many younger people, I often felt a sense of rebellion, but not now, not in this position. But also to reflect on how the world has changed and how it continues to change. And right now, I think we're in a really difficult, challenging period. I mean, not that any other period isn't difficult and challenging, but the notion that somehow there's something inevitable about democracy, or that the world, the arc of the world is always heading in a positive direction. The kind of the Whig theory of history, that it's just everything improves slowly but surely, moving towards some great triumphant goal. I don't feel that in the world right now. I think we're in a real fight, a real struggle for democracy against autocracy, and that it's a difficult moment for the world, and it's certainly a difficult moment at the UN, because the UN is a place where all these forces are at work, and where you can see them on display. It's not always pretty, and the UN is a very imperfect institution, and its imperfections really, in part stem from the structures that it was left with, or that were created in 1945, and the vetoes and various other things that make it hard to kind of really move things forward. But it still does some things that no other institution can do, and it still is a place where these things are debated, at least, and worked through. And I feel on COVID, on climate change, on digital technology and its impact on conflict, this is still a good place. This is good place for me to be, and to try to put my oar in the water, and not just talk. I mean, it does allow us to talk. Yes, you go back and say, well, what is good about democracy, and what is the advantage of it? How does it express itself? But to take that into the arena, and know that there are people who are listening from other countries that don't agree with you, and have a very different perspective. So you have to listen to them, but you don't have to agree with them, and they don't have to agree with you. But at least we're engaging.
What's been the most pleasant surprise and the most unpleasant surprise?
Well, the most pleasant surprise has been, for me personally, is that I was thrown into the deep end on two issues. One of them was the issue of peace building, and the other one was COVID-19 and its impact, both economically and socially. And I found that some of the skills and perspectives that I developed over many, many years were very helpful and very useful. And that I think I've been able to provide a bit of perspective to some of my colleagues, but also to the people that I work with. And so I felt gratified in that sense. The frustrating thing, I think, is I hadn't realized before I got here how very hierarchical the UN is, how it's a very, very structured place. The P5 are very much, the kind of the power brokers. And you really have a sense of being, as a middle power where we are. You really know you're kind of in the middle of this thing, and sometimes it's hard to have the influence or to make get your oar in as well as you'd like to, and that's been frustrating. But I think it's also forcing us to learn how to work with a whole bunch of other folks who are in the same position, and to really engage with a range of countries that are like-minded and affected. And I think Canada, because of the way we've done things over the years, is got a pretty good track record of listening and engaging with a range of other countries, not just our immediate allies or the G7 or the G20, which we're members of, but to go beyond that and really try to work, if you like, across the aisle with countries that are and may have a very different experience and different perspective. And that I think has been really really important. And also finally, the other perspective is, I think, very much part of the UN is the extent to which colonialism and imperialism have left a very tough legacy, and we're still dealing with the impact of it. And you can feel it, and you can feel the resentments and the inequalities and the challenges of those relationships, which go back a long way. And it's very much part of, our history, which we need to understand.
Yeah, I'm very struck by how at both the COP26 in Glasgow and the discussions that are going on at the World Health Organization, the main focus is on issues of global inequality that have stemmed from colonialist history and unequal development. And then the calls, therefore, for Northern Hemisphere countries to create funds and amass resources that can try to help equalize the balance. And from the developing world, this is very insistent, but from the Northern Hemisphere countries, it's something that I think that they're not sure exactly how to deal with. I'm interested, as an American, how do you think Biden is doing? And as someone at Oxford, how do you think the Brits are doing in this whole process?
Well, I'm going to be very candid, because I got nothing to lose, right? I'm not running for anything. I think America is not fully back yet. I know the expression is "we're back." My sense is, there's still ground to cover in terms of reaching out and really engaging. And I think that this is partly the product of the president's situation at home, that he has got so much to do in Washington, so much to do with dealing with the challenges that he faces internally, that it's really hard for the Americans to play the kind of powerful leadership role I think many people would like them to play, but in a positive way. And I think there's been a lot of ways in which American power has been really tested in the last 20, 30 years. And lots of issues and questions arising from the exercise of that power. The Brits, I'll be very candid again. I think I deeply regret the Brexit decision. I really think it was a step in the wrong direction. And frankly, when we're really trying to push forward on liberal democratic ideas and trying to really engage with more successful international institutions, something that weakens any effective international institution. And I think the European Union and the European objective is a very important ideal for the world, not just for Europe. It's sad. So I mean, I think this will all sort out in some way. I mean, things will move ahead. And I also regret the decision on DFID. I think the cutback on DFID has been tough, and it's sent not the signal that I think is necessary at this time. We need to be reinforcing solidarity, which means Western governments are going to have to do more. Whatever else philosophically we come to conclude about unequal development, about how to move forward on all, and practically what we do on COP26. But when you look at climate change, you look at COVID, you look at the digital divide, you look at the extent of conflict in Africa and some other parts of the world, Afghanistan, Myanmar, you need to think about why solidarity is so important. It's such an important idea. So anything that takes away from solidarity, global solidarity, is not a good thing. And that's what I believe. And I don't want to offend either my American or my British friends, but that's how I feel.
Well, as someone who's supported Biden and worked in his administration for the first 9 months, I think we're like a football team that had the first 100 plays mapped out. Those plays went pretty well. And then then we started, trying to fight the real world as it was developing, particularly the Afghanistan onslaught, and it became very messy. And I personally like Biden, having known him for many years. I think he's a decent and decisive president. And we've had presidents who were decent but not particularly decisive, and we had presidents who are decisive but not particularly decent. And so I hold out hope for his administration, which I think on most issues is trying to do the right thing and get back to an internationalist vision, in which it's really a Kantian vision to go back to Isaiah Berlin, and which makes the role of Canada and the UK incredibly important as like-mindeds participating in this community of democracies. I think the Brits still are finding their way post-Brexit. They haven't identified their role. COP26, I think, was a valiant effort, but in many ways a missed opportunity. I think Johnson was supposed to be engaged and was distracted. And as a result, many of the issues that Sharma was trying to address got kicked down the road. So there are a lot of pledges, but it may well be that the final conclusions on the Glasgow Declaration come next year in Egypt or the year after or somewhere else. So I don't know. It's interesting to be in the UK as people are struggling with the post-Brexit identity. And I think for now, people are just happy to be getting past COVID. And so it's a little hard to project into this sort of vision of global Britain, how it will play out, especially when devolution and other issues are still weighing very heavily.
Yeah.
Supply chain shortages, rising gas prices, et cetera, et cetera.
So a couple of thoughts, Harold, on that. One of them is what Harold Macmillan used to say when he was asked to explain, as he was retiring, asked to explain, how his early vision in 57, 58 had really not been fully realized by the time of his retirement in 1963. And he said, events, dear boy, events. And so when I look at Biden and even look, anybody in politics, you say you had this wonderful thought process that, got you to where you are. What is it that blew you off course? And you say, well, stuff happens. And frankly, I'm not one of those people who believes that everything happens for a reason. It doesn't always happen for a reason. Sometimes just bad stuff just happens. And I think that's just a reality of politics. But I think the sense that we need to mobilize in favor of some key things like climate change. I was never one of those people who thought that one conference was going to be a turning point. I don't believe that, because I think the turning is actually damn difficult, and it's all domestic. The pledges that we make to others, but then when you go home, you have to figure out, well, okay, how do we actually do this? How do we meet this target? How do we know this is unprecedented in the management of the modern economy globally? For the last 300 years, we have not deliberately set out to say, we are going to change how we produce things, and we are going to change the energy system of the globe. And it's the fuel and the energy and all of that that's creating global emissions. We are going to change all these things. We are going to, by acts of government, we are going to change this. That's tough to do. That's it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And to do it without pain and without higher prices and without causing a great deal of dislocation is frankly impossible. It's a dislocating experience. And so I don't think we should expect that a bunch of people getting together at a conference and then other people outside demonstrating is going to actually make this any easier. We have to keep doing this every year. This process of meeting and trying to, get the religion back and saying, okay, But the actual process of getting there is really, really tough. And I think one of the reasons is because everybody is green in general. But when you come down to saying, okay, what does this really mean for you? Or for you, or for this community, or for that company? It's people become a little less green in particular. And that's one of one of the phenomena we've seen since Kyoto has been everybody says targets. And then people say, let's have more ambitious targets. Doesn't matter how ambitious your targets are. If you can't take the steps that will actually implement the targets, then we're in great difficulty. But I believe strongly in certain basic sort of liberal social democratic principles. We need to share. We need to, first of all, make a fundamental decision. Are we really going to do this? And if we are really going to do it, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to require solidarity and incredible persistence, just unbelievable persistence. And there will still be, countries that will say, well, we'll come along a little later than you. And I think you've described it before. The challenge with China and India is their argument is, well, wait a minute, we've only just come to the party, in Korea. I mean, we've only just joined the rapidly industrializing benefits of old time capitalism, and now you want us to give it all up? And well, no, and you're asking us to make this sacrifice. You never made a sacrifice like this in the 18th century, or in the 19th century, or in the 20th century, and now you're asking us to do it. So it's not surprising.
Where's our century of pollution? You guys had one.
Yeah, you actually had 3 or 4 when you think about it.
So Bob, I'm interested, do you feel an authoritarian coalition in New York that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And how do you feel them? How do they operate?
Well, the irony is they call themselves the Charter Group, and I've got in my pocket, I always carry my dad's copy of the Charter. I carry it with me because when the Charter Group cuts together, China, Russia, Algeria, North Korea, down the list of countries that they're part of this little group. They always say, the Charter was a bold statement against any outside interference in self-determination, and any outside interference in sovereignty. And I said, where exactly does the Charter say that? Like I've read the Charter a few times, and I go through it quite often. The Charter talks about human rights. The Charter talks about the rule of law. The Charter talks about, the scourge of war. We wouldn't have created a United Nations as an organization if all we wanted to do was protect the sovereignty of nations. We just say, go to it, guys. And that's not what the United Nations is all about. But yeah, definitely. Well, we see it in different techniques. I mean, the Russians basically want to try to really slow things down. And they're very, very good at reading the rules. They're very good at, moving things more slowly. And the Chinese have a very different ambition. Their vision, I think, is one where the institution will increasingly, ideally, in their view, reflect their values and their thinking and the thinking of countries like them. And they're doing a lot to advance that in some quite strong ways. You see this in debates, you see it in resolutions, you see it in how the Security Council is not working. The reluctance to really allow the Security Council to take hold of very much, which Canada's tried twice in the last 20 years to get on the Security Council. When I got here, I said, wait, let's not worry about that. We're going to be not on the Security Council for most of the time we're at the UN. So let's figure out what else we can do where somebody else doesn't have a veto, so we can do stuff. And that's really how I've been trying to get our government to focus a little bit. I see Helen's come on now. She wants to shut up.
The master is here.
I certainly don't want you to shut up. That's been just so gripping. I've just got. Oh, I've lost them again. Your old friend Bob Tim Weiskell has got lots of comments and questions. Mainly, he wants you to join in a North American Rhodes Scholar reunion and so on. That's the main message. So I'll leave just a couple of questions. One of which you kind of already answered in talking about your experience at the UN. I'll ask the second first, which is from Rupa Unikrishnan, who said, what do you both think of the phenomenon that Anne Applebaum so effectively captured in her Atlantic article, the autocrats are winning. Indeed, they are colluding to reshape the world. Have you read
I agree with her. I think, first of all, I think Anne Applebaum is terrific. I really admire her and admire the work that she's done over so many years. I've become a huge fan over many years of her thinking. I guess the slight difference of opinion I would be is, I'm not sure the autocrats are winning. I think that, like a lot of other situations historically, it's all about how willing are we to really take them on. I mean, if you look at the difficult years between the wars, there were clearly, I mean, the Nazis and the Soviet communists were winning, and the Japanese Empire and the Italian Empire striking at Ethiopia. You say, well, yeah, they're on the run, but it took the democratic powers a while to really figure out we got to get into this. Now, I'm not calling for war in the same sense, but I do believe that there has to be a much greater, grittier determination to say, wait a minute, we've got good values here. We are responding to some very powerful needs that people have to be able to express themselves, for pluralism, for difference in the world. And we have to just be able to really stick with it and fight back, frankly, and not give up on the institutions that we built, and look seriously at where we're being pushed around and how we can effectively push back. I do think, however, one has to look at the interventions of the last 20, 30 years in Iraq and in Afghanistan and say, okay, let's really assess what happened. Let's really try to figure out how to do it better and how to do it differently. But we can't let others just rule the roost without any kind of response.
Yeah, but we have to learn those lessons. Harold, did you have any comments on that?
I think the authoritarians see a path to victory, but I don't think they're winning yet. And I think the question is how to counter that with an alternative, superior vision, which is really the global democracy delivers. I think that's one of the themes of Biden's Summit for Democracy. When you're in an old building, you like to read old books. And, if you read Kant's Toward Perpetual Peace, he's basically saying that a federation of free states cooperating around common values, a United Nations, has a greater possibility of success, combined with societies which are free and also open, thus, permitting tremendous upward mobility, which, both of our families came to our countries and with very little, and we got a chance to serve in very important positions. I think Oxford and Balliol play an incredibly important role here in shifting from what was called the old boy network into kind of a network for democratic discussion among people, like-minded people from many nations. Yeah. If I can just mention one thing that I think is very important, my late father was deeply aided in when his government was deposed by a military coup in Korea by Walt Rostow. And Walt Rostow called his brother, Eugene Rostow, who was dean of Yale Law School at the time, who offered my father a job. And we moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and Yale Law School. 40 years later, I was the dean of Yale Law School, showing this openness. And it was only when I read Bob's book that I understood that Walt Rostow was a graduate of Balliol who had studied with Bob's father, and that Eugene Rostow was the Eastman professor.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. No,
Amazing.
Gene Rostow was here when I was here. I used to accost him when he was walking along, and I introduced myself, and he remembered my dad because my dad was and my mother were very close with Walt and his wife. In fact, they both met each other at a conference, a student conference in Geneva in 1937. So that's how they struck up a strong friendship.
I'm very conscious, Bob, that we've got about 2 minutes more with you, but Stephen Lukes has asked a question, which is completely pertinent to the fact that you are just off to the UN. Where, to use your phrase, do you think Canada can do stuff, he asks?
I think there's, I guess, 3 areas or 4 areas. One, very quickly, Stephen, I think we're working hard on trying to get the rich countries to do more on COVID economically. And I think Canada's, continues to work very closely with Jamaica. In fact, I'm heading off to a meeting right now as I speak with the Deputy Secretary General on this very subject. I think we can work by example on COP26. We're a large energy producing country. If we can set an example in terms of how we make the transition, I think that'll be important. Similarly on digital, the more we can point out the consequences of this inequality continuing, and finally, effectively on conflict, both peace building and peacekeeping. And I'm off to Seoul next week to the peacekeeping summit of ministers to talk about some of those issues. So yeah, I think there are areas we can make a difference. But the key thing, I mean, to be very blunt, is that our actions have to match our words, and that's always the challenge.
That's great. I think we must let you go. We've got some fabulous, we'll pass on these questions about.
Please do.
A bit of a strand about Bill Williams and his influence on the 1969 class of Rhodes Scholars. And his
well, Bill was a wonderfully kind man, and our generation was quite mixed up in a variety of ways. I think President Clinton talked about this as well when he was agonizing about what to do. And I think Bill was just a very, very kind person. And I can tell you from my point of view, he was exceptionally kind when I was flailing around after I finished my B.Phil. And he couldn't have been nicer. So I think his quiet kind of wisdom made a big difference to people like me. And I know there are many others who experience the same thing.
Helen, I think we should say it's American Thanksgiving, and when you give thanks, you think about the institutions you've been lucky to be affiliated with in your life. And I'm lucky that at this point in my life, I got a chance to be affiliated with Balliol. So joining you all very late, but still very gratefully.
Well, I'm still waiting for my comeback.
Anytime, Bob. I mean,
I have a post-diplomatic career to think about, right? I mean,
yeah.
my next period of reflection.
Let us know when you're free, and we'll book a room. Or we might even book the Eastman Penthouse.
The Eastman flat is available, Bob. The Eastman flat's available.
I'm just making a pitch, that's all.
Yeah, no, it's a very good pitch. It's been a very persuasive hour-long pitch, I think.
Just across from Hollywell Manor. You can go back.
I know where it is. I know exactly where it is.
Exactly. That's wonderful. Thank you so much to Harold and Bob for that. I do want to give a special vote of thanks to Ruth Sheaves, who's leaving us, sadly, to go off into the private sector. But she's done a fabulous job, particularly, well, through all of COVID, setting up these kind of online webinars, reaching out to all sorts of alumni who've joined us for the first time or in a different way and so on. So many thanks to them. Many thanks to you, Bob and Harold. And thank you to all of you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. And good luck in your meeting, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you. See you later. Take care.
Harold, theory into action is great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye all.